Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steve Abed. I'm the head of the Social Sciences Department, and I'd like to welcome you this evening. We'll begin in just a minute with our speaker, but I wanted to take a minute and talk about the reception that we had out in the entryway there. The folks that put the symposium together thought it'd be nice to have a reception, and we talked about the kind of food we could have, and then we thought it might be a good idea to link the theme of the conference to the food. And so we thought about Julia Childs and her contribution to culinary arts and the cuisine. And so the food that was out there were recipes that were introduced by Julia Child. And there were little recipe cards on the tables. I don't know if you saw those or not, but if you didn't on the way out, you may want to grab some and sort of learn a little bit about what that was that you were eating and what delightful food it was. And I want to thank our Banquet Services Department for coordinating all of that and for coming up with those ideas and putting it all together for us. So let's give them a round of applause. And at this point, to introduce our keynote speaker is Professor Mike Light from the Social Sciences Department.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for showing up. Just to give you a little bit of format for this evening, we're going to have a paper presentation, a lecture, followed by a question and answer session. We have 2 mobile microphones that we'd like to use because we are recording this, so we're going to ask that you speak into the microphone if you have a question during that time period. I know that turns some people off, but it's a requirement, so if you ask me, do I have to use this, I'll say, yes, you do, okay? So just keep that in mind as we near the end. And it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this inaugural conference on the history of gender and sexuality. Her name is Dr. Maria Cotera, and I'll give you a little bit of background about Dr. Cotera. She graduated in 1986 with a BA degree from the University of Texas at Austin. She is also holding an MA from the University of Texas at Austin, a PhD from Stanford University in Modern Thought and Literature. She's currently the Associate Professor and Women's Studies Program and Program in American Culture, Latino Studies at the University of Michigan in that department. Dr. Cotera's work has centered on crafting an intellectual history of women of color. Her book, Native Speakers, attempts to do this from a comparative perspective, tracing the literary and ethnographic contributions of 3 women of color in the first half of the 20th century. Native Speakers was recently awarded the 2009 National Women's Studies Association Book Prize. That prize is awarded for groundbreaking scholarship in women's studies that makes significant contributions to women of color and transnational scholarship. Dr. Cotera's new project, Chicana por mi raza, Uncovering the Hidden History of Chicana Feminist Thought, traces the development of Chicana feminist thought from its early activist roots in the second wave to its current academic articulations. So please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Dr. Maria Cotera.
All right, thanks for that nice introduction, Mike. I'd like to thank Professor Mike Light for inviting me to speak at your Gender and Sexuality Conference. It's really an honor to be here with you tonight, and I hope that it'll be just the beginning of many fruitful conversations and future collaborations. Those of you here who are familiar with the history of writing by women of color, an intellectual tradition that, as Professor Light pointed out, stands at the center of my own work, will no doubt recognize the passage invoked in the title of this address. And the title of my address is Invisibility is an Unnatural Disaster, Why Women's History Still Matters. It's actually taken from an essay by Japanese-American feminist writer Mitsue Yamada, and it first appeared in the path-breaking anthology This Bridge Called My Back, published in 1981. In it, Yamada traces the ways in which discourses, even liberatory, ethnic, and feminist discourses, have silenced, marginalized, and made invisible the experiences of Asian American women. She notes that this invisibilizing is neither accidental nor unintentional, but is instead a product of structural racism and sexism as they impinge on human relations. Her essay refers as well to the self-reproducing nature of invisibility. When one is invisible in the public imaginary, one becomes invisible to oneself. and less likely to claim visibility through political speech, thought, and action. This fate is a familiar one to most women of color who have wrestled with the question of visibility and its politics for multiple generations. Given their historical marginalization in almost every realm of human endeavor, women of color have well understood how visibility matters. Indeed, they've been caught in its double binds, shuttling between hypervisibility, when their salvation is used as a justification for empire, and invisibility, their seeming natural state. This marginalization has left a whole generation of young men and women of color to feel that they are a people without history, or more precisely, without a history of women as actors and thinkers and shapers of their world and its affairs. As we know, the historical imagination matters as well, and in the most fundamental sense, because it undeniably shapes what can be imagined in the present moment. Because of this, historiography is something more than simply a scholarly enterprise. It is, whether we acknowledge it or not, a deeply political project. And like all politics, the practice of history inevitably gives rise to broader questions about inclusion, exclusion, and representation. Feminists of the second wave understood this, and they constructed histories of women's experience that unveiled their contributions and reshaped the popular imagination in the interests of women's equity and liberation. Scholars of color stormed the barricades in the 60s as well, reshaping history to meet the political needs of nationalist agendas. And emergent queer histories have challenged the invisibility of non-normative sexual subjects, as well as the invisibilizing heteronormative optics that have shaped our understanding of sexuality today. All of these challenges to business as usual in the practice of history have been founded on the idea that one can render visible what was previously invisible. Unfortunately, as the post-structuralist critics at the center of history's linguistic turn in the 80s argued, these overtly political historical projects relied too often on unproblematized notions of subjectivity, representation, and human experience that reflected and even reinforced dominant discursive logics. In her groundbreaking essay, The Evidence of Experience, Joan Wallach Scott issued what amounted to a theoretical fatwa on what she termed, rather dismissively in my view, histories of difference. And these would have been women's history, ethnic history, and the like. Such histories, which seek to reveal hidden realms of experience centering on previously invisibilized subjects, minorities, women, queer subjects, more often than not achieved exactly the opposite of their intended purpose, Scott concluded. Because in their appeal to visuality as a primary imperative and marginalized experience as a primary site of evidence, they reinforce dominant historiographic tropes that have constituted certain historical subjects as marginal and others as central. Moreover, according to Scott, such histories posit a problematic causal relationship between experience and subject formation, leaving underanalyzed the ways in which experience itself is a product of dominant discursive logics. Drawing on scholars like Foucault and Lacan, Scott argues that it is only by virtue of the discursive practices that differentiate and regulate subjects that one attains awareness of one's identity, desire, interest, and spheres of existence. Historians of difference, she argues, conceive of their challenge to mainstream historiography as a correction to oversights resulting from inaccurate or incomplete vision. The problem for Scott is that the interpretive challenge of such historical projects, it relies upon the idea that subjects or their historical experiences need only be unveiled to be understood. Histories of difference, therefore, rely on the assumption that the historical experiences of women of color, queer subjects, and the like can be revealed, which places those identities in the discursive logics underwriting them outside of critical scrutiny. In Scott's own words, quote, "When experience is taken as the origin of knowledge, the vision of the individual subject, the person who had the experience or the historian who recounts it, becomes the bedrock of evidence on which explanation is built. Questions about the constructed nature of experience, about how subjects are constituted as different in the first place, about how one's vision is structured, about language or discourse and history, those questions are left aside. The evidence of experience then becomes the evidence for the fact of difference rather than a way of exploring how difference is established, how it operates, how and in what ways it constitutes subjects who see and act in the world. For Scott, then, the problem lies precisely in the truth claims of experience, which she believes weaken the critical thrust of histories of difference. Instead of visibilizing these experiences of marginalized subjects, historians should instead focus their analytical lens on the projects that have constructed difference and the discursive logics that undergird them. While Scott's important critical intervention, among others, has had positive effects, I think, on the practice of history, especially in the area of scholarship on gender and sexuality, it also raises problematic questions for those of us who have invested much time and effort in tracing the development of forms of thought and praxis that are grounded in narratives of experience. Moreover, in my view, both Scott's critique and her proposed solution effectively recreate the margin-periphery relations that have governed knowledge production for several hundred years. And I'll give you an example of this. I'm reminded here of a few instances in which feminist scholars have taken Scott's critique to its logical conclusion, thinking that they were doing the right thing by the marginalized subjects they were studying. In one case, an otherwise fascinating academic talk I attended on transnational circuits of surrogate motherhood in India offered a very abstracted analysis of the discourses of power produced by a regional clinic in rural India. The analysis was of brochures, posters, contracts, public statements, the sort of interviews with the clinic operators and the like. The analysis entirely eliminated the voices of the poor rural women who were acting as surrogates. When asked by an audience member whether or not she had actually queried rural women as to their own ideas about surrogacy, the scholar critiqued the impulse behind the question and suggested that the will to know the minds of marginalized subjects and to represent them was itself an enactment of power. Moreover, because the will to represent such subjects was fraught with problematic power relations, the only ethical stance for her to take was to focus her analytic lens on the discourses that constructed surrogacy for both the Western women who traveled to India to collect their babies and the rural Indian women who acted as surrogates. I invoke this example not to criticize other feminist scholars who are doing really important work, but to illuminate the political consequences that Scott's critique and those of other post-structuralist feminist theorists have had on the production of knowledge within the academy. To be sure, marginalized subjects aren't just out there to be recovered from the lacunae of history. They are produced in and through a discursive field that is both historically contingent and ever-present. But this discursive field is also produced through the interactions of dominant discursive logics that define the limits of the possible and what feminist critic Sherry Stone Mediatore has called the excess, the articulations of marginalized and oppressed subjects who either speak from the boundaries, expanding core notions of subjectivity, or redefine the logics of dominance from within. And while this excess must be understood in relationship to dominant discourse, it's even a product of it, it would be a mistake to focus on dominant discourse while ignoring the excess. To do so is to create an echo chamber of power in which the subaltern subject must always remain silent, while the discursive logics that produce her marginalization are accorded even more descriptive power. So how might we recover this excess without succumbing to the familiar pitfalls of generalization and essentialism, and without underestimating the power of dominant discourse to shape its articulations, its very conceptions of resistance? Moreover, how can we do so without privileging one epistemic system or way of knowing over another, especially when the very methodologies we deploy as historians typically rely upon systems of knowledge power like the archive, print media, state documents, and the like as the basis for our claims? And finally, and perhaps most crucially, what are the personal and political consequences of historical recovery? To address the second part of my title, why and how does women's history still matter? To answer the first of these questions, I'm going to discuss some of the insights I've gained from my own 15-year engagement with recovery work, particularly what I learned from the research I did for my recently published book, Native Speakers. As for the second set of questions, which speak directly to what is at stake in the act of recovery, I'd like to talk briefly about the work I'm doing right now, my second project, work that I'm doing with undergraduates, two of whom are community college transfer students, which my second project mobilizes new media to democratize the process of historical recovery in the interest of expanding our understanding of social movement history. Okay, so the dilemmas that I outlined in the first part of this talk shadow my own recovery work, which seeks to render visible the historical articulations of women of color intellectuals. And I think what's really important to remember about this is that there's really no such thing as women of color intellectuals, right? There's not a history where we can sort of trace back, like, for example, like we would with the philosophical, continental philosophy, right? Where one thinker influences the other and influences the next into the present day. We don't have that kind of canonical tradition. And so to create a history of women of color intellectuals is in some ways to engage in a kind of willful fiction or canon formation. So my recently published book, Native Speakers, attempts to do this from a comparative perspective, tracing the literary and ethnographic contributions of three women of color in the first half of the 20th century. Native Speakers is basically an intellectual history situated in the borderlands between conventional accounts of anthropology, literature, women's history, and African American, Mexican American, and Native American intellectual genealogies. The book charts a complex, interconnected history of three women of color intellectuals working in the field of ethnographic meaning-making in the early 20th century. Ella Cara Deloria, who was Dakota Sioux, who worked closely with Franz Boas, recognized as the father of modern anthropology, and she worked with him in the 30s and in the 40s, beginning in 1927. The other woman is Zora Neale Hurston, who some of you may have heard of. She's an African-American folklorist. She also worked with Franz Boas while she was living in New York, but she's also recognized as a very famous writer in the Harlem Renaissance milieu. And the third woman is Haveta Gonzalez. She is a Mexican-American woman who was the protege in the 1920s and 30s of the recognized father of Southwest folklore studies, J. Frank Dobie. And Haveta Gonzalez was also the president and vice president of the Texas Folklore Society in the 1930s, early 1930s, which was quite an accomplishment given that she was a woman and there had never been a woman president of the Folklore Society. And she was also a Mexican-American in Texas during a time of pretty deep racial strife. Okay. So while Deloria, Hurston, and Gonzalez produced innovative ethnographic accounts of their own communities and rose to prominence within the related fields of ethnology and folklore studies in the early 20s and 30s, they also turned away from ethnographic meaning-making at key junctures in their careers and explored the realm of storytelling through vivid mixed-genre novels centered on the lives of women. So the question that I had at the heart of Native Speakers was why the turn from science, i.e. ethnology, anthropology, the social sciences, to fiction? I answered this question first by tracing the various ways in which Deloria, Hurston, and Gonzalez contended with dominant forms of knowledge production about their communities in both their ethnographic writing and their ethnographic practice by articulating sometimes contradictory positions between various polarities at the heart of ethnography, polarities of self and other, tradition and progress, insider and outsider. And it's important to remember that at this time in history, anthropology really imagined itself as an engagement with an exotic other, right? And one of the things that ethnography was really after was a kind of objectivity, right? It wanted to become a social science. So that meant it wanted to mirror the sort of objectivism of the natural sciences. And what's required there is a kind of impartial observer, right? And you can see immediately where problems might arise with women who are studying their own communities. So I argue that their complex positionality as outsiders within, trained anthropologists or folklorists working within communities in which they had a relationship to the people they were studying, troubled the boundaries of ethnographic practice and shaped their relationship to the field and its truth claims. Though their ethnographic writing describes different communities, in Ella Deloria's case, Native communities, Haveta Gonzalez, Mexican-American communities, Zora, Neale, Hurston, Black communities. So their writing looks at different communities and engages in different kinds of ethnographic writing, from blurred genre folklore to very scientific ethnological discourse. What connects their narratives is an ambivalent author-subject, right, the person writing the work, who attempts to negotiate her position as both an ethnographer and a native via complex systems of disavowal and connection to the discourses of ethnography, which at the time posited an impartial observer as the ideal author-subject. Of course, maintaining the objectivist fiction of an impartial author-subject presented immediate challenges for women who identified politically with the communities whose histories, traditions, and experiences they sought to describe. Another challenge for them was the deeply gendered nature of typical representations of the ethnographic encounter. Trinh Minh Ha has observed that anthropological visions of encounter have historically marginalized Native women from an imagined dialogue that at its root involves a conversation between white men about primitive Native man. The turn to fiction, then, partially resolved these narrative dilemmas by relocating textual authority from the impartial observer to the female storyteller, a rhetorical strategy that signals an epistemic shift in their writing and connects their novels to the work of contemporary women of color writers and theorists. It is in the discursive field created between their ethnographic writing, which largely conformed to the idioms of dominant ethnography, and their gendered storytelling, that one might find the excess to which Stone Mediatori refers. It's the excess that articulates what cannot be expressed in the idioms of standard ethnographies, the experience of the other as speaking subject. It's worth noting that in Native Speakers, I recover the work of women who themselves were committed to the project of recovery. Indeed, Margaret Mead famously described anthropology and its related disciplines as a giant salvage project, and anthropology was popularly conceived as a form of recovery initiated to preserve dead and dying cultures in the wake of modernization and industrialization. Deloria, Hurston, and Gonzalez surely understood, even better than most white anthropologists, how the effect of broad cultural transformations like the settlement of the West and the great migration of African Americans to the urban North had impacted traditional cultural forms. They were also aware that precious little had been written about their historical experiences, and even less about women in their communities. Moreover, what little information did exist about Blacks, Indians, and Mexicans in the 1920s largely functioned as a justification for a racial order that segregated Blacks and Mexicans from whites and confined Indians to a noble past. When these women put pen to paper to transcribe what they remembered from childhood and what they learned from their research and their forays into the field as adults, they surely realized that to do so would mean writing against a history of discourse about the other that had been constructed through both scientific and popular text over decades of continued asymmetrical colonial and imperial encounters. Which is to say that, like Joan Scott, they were keenly aware of the politics of representation, the ways in which representational forms like historiography, ethnography, and literature had created a discursive field in which gender, racial, and class hierarchies were naturalized through the misrecognition and homogenization of their communities and histories. They nevertheless engaged with the very discourses that had read their difference as a justification for their subordination. But in the process, they reshaped this discourse, turning its idioms, its logics, and its rhetoric against itself. That Hurston, Deloria, and Gonzalez each chose to reformulate their ethnographic research into historical fiction suggests a shared dissatisfaction with the limitations of ethnography, both in terms of its narrative constraints and its largely academic audience. But it also suggests something else, a critical intervention against the truth claims of the dominant discourses that had sought to describe and thereby confine American Indians, African Americans, and Mexican Americans in the early 20th century. And I argue in my book that they elaborated this critical intervention by crafting historical novels that drew heavily on their research and fieldwork in order to engender a sense of verisimilitude or truthiness, as one pundit likes to call it, and add authenticity and authority to their representation of women's worlds. Let me give you some examples. Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, written in 1935, is the most well-known of these novels that are based in truth, right, or fact, ethnographic fact, but are fictional renditions of that fact. Ella Deloria's novel Water Lily, which was written in the 1940s in the midst of her research on the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations, was never published, not until 1988, long after her death. Gonzalez's Caballero, who she co-wrote with a white woman, and we can talk about that later. It's a very interesting novel about 1848, also based on her historical and ethnographic research, also a book that remained unpublished during her lifetime and was published in 1996. So all of these books, except for Their Eyes Were Watching God, were published, or both of these books were published posthumously. While it's not so surprising that these novels are rich in ethnographic detail, what is somewhat surprising is the way in which each of these novels mobilizes the historical past in what seems like a corrective gesture, an attempt to articulate the historical presence and perhaps more importantly, the historical agency of women in their communities. In other words, these ethno-historical fictions were essentially works of historical recovery. Indeed, while Deloria, Hurston, and Gonzalez's ethno-historical novels were undeniably works of fiction, the dense ethnographic and historical detail upon which they constructed their sense of verisimilitude seems to suggest the contingent and subjective nature of knowledge production and its dominant discursive logics. In other words, by mimicking the realist strategies of description evident in ethnographic and historical works of the period, the fictive worlds created by Deloria, Hurston, and Gonzalez called into question the truth claims of the putatively real representations of their communities in dominant scholarship. For example, Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, is set in Eatonville in Polk County, the very same locations that appear in her popular folklore book, Mules and Men, a supposedly true account of her folklore research in Florida. The novel deploys these real fieldwork sites alongside real historical events like the Great Lake Okeechobee flood of 1928 as backdrops for a fictional account of a black woman's coming to consciousness, an account that resembles, curiously enough, another realist ethnographic form, the life history. This collapse of the real and the fictional accords Janie Crawford, the novel's central protagonist, a sense of historical agency, as well as the narrative authority to describe and thereby illuminate the gender, racial, and class dimensions of Black life in the post-Reconstruction South. Similarly, Water Lily presents a vision of 19th century Dakota communal life through a mode of historical realism that mimics the realist ethnographies and life history narratives of the Boasian generation. But it does so from the inside out, centering on the perspectives of 3 generations of Native women. Though Water Lily, like Their Eyes Were Watching God, suggests the life history in its Bildungsroman narrative, it revises the individualist ethos of this ethnographic form in an effort to tell the collective story of a people and to draw readers into the camp circle where the women at the center of the novel deftly educate them in the guiding principles of Dakota society. And through this education, they assimilate readers into its internal logic. Water Lily's focus on kinship obligations and relatedness, which stands at the center of Dakota culture and is thus an overarching theme of the novel, is something more than simply a fictional illumination of an ethno-historical fact. Indeed, if we accept that kinship was the center of the Dakota way of life, as the novel literally teaches us to do, then the dominant vision of the Sioux as a warlike culture is revealed to be a fiction, a discursive logic that functions as a rationale for genocide and colonization. And finally, we have the example of Haveta Gonzalez's Caballero, which deploys a real historical event, the U.S.-Mexico War, and the workings of romance to tell a tale of love in times of war that reveals the impact of nation building on women. Caballero opens in 1846 at the outbreak of hostilities between the United States and Mexico over the narrow strip of land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. In response to this conflict, the hero of the novel, a patriarch named Don Santiago, who runs a hacienda located squarely in the middle of the contested territory, vows to resist the Anglo invaders at all costs, but the unanticipated costs of his resistance are very high. Don Santiago eventually loses his children, his laborers, and even his sanity as a result of his refusal to compromise with the invading forces. As his family and his servants betray him by consorting with the enemy through a variety of romantic, artistic, and economic encounters, Don Santiago's patriarchal reign over the hacienda begins to crumble, along with his identity, initiating a slow descent into madness. With its linkage of historical romance and Lyrian tragedy, Caballero explores the politics of betrayal, even as it outlines the perils and possibilities of various forms of collaboration. As such, the novel offers a uniquely gendered vision of borderlands history and reveals that state building is not merely a matter of armies and bureaucrats drawing abstract borderlines, but also of how people come to link or refuse to link their daily lives and shifting identities to the larger imagined community of a nation. As such, the novel quite literally engenders a post-1848 borderlands, illuminating the ways in which the intimacies of interpersonal contact, love, as well as subjects' self-conceptions as gendered beings and their notions of family can by turns advance, undermine, or complicate the larger state and racial projects that have repeatedly redrawn the map of North America. But the novel also subtly undermines the business as usual in Texas folklore studies and historiography in the 1930s by signifying on the dominant representational strategies that helped to rationalize westward expansion. And here a reading of romance enters into the picture. Just as their eyes were watching God and Water Lily call into question the epistemological limits of Western knowingness in their representations of ethnographic historical data as the stuff of fiction, Caballero's figuration of history and folklore as romance threatens to expose the truth claims of Texas history and folklore studies as a constructed referent rather than a natural state of existence. So Hurston, Deloria, and Gonzalez's redeployments of historical fact in the service of fiction suggest to me a feminist engagement a critical feminist engagement with the dominant historiography of their time. By centering on women's lives and revealing the complexity of gendered and racialized experience through the prism of an imagined but nevertheless factual past, their novels engage in a practice of historical imagining that is free from the methodological constraints of history and ethnography and can therefore illuminate occluded dimensions of experience for which there may be no evidence other than stories passed down from generation to generation. In other words, Hurston, Deloria, and Gonzalez's novels represent the excess at the margins of accepted history, an excess that calls the totalizing discourse of history into question. Indeed, I read these novels as engaging in a kind of critical feminist historiography recast as decolonizing storytelling that rewrites history's dominant tropes and imagines different endings for the tragic narratives of colonialism and imperialism that have structured marginalized people's relationship with the real. As such, they move beyond mere corrective gestures. Yes, they fill in historical gaps, but they are also acts of the imagination that willfully signify on the narrative forms of dominant discourse in order to shed new light on the structure of historical reality and historical knowledge. My historical recovery project, unlike those elaborated by Hurston, Deloria, and Gonzalez, relies almost entirely on the evidence of the archive, their letters, their writings, both published and unpublished, and the work of mainstream ethnographers and historians of their generation that constituted the discursive field against which they intervened. Nevertheless, my recovery project shares much with theirs. First, it seeks to illuminate the excess, the articulations of marginalized and oppressed subjects who reshape prevailing idioms of power and redefine the logics of dominance from inside. It is also an act of the imagination, a necessary fiction that draws the work of an earlier generation of women of color intellectuals into conversation with our own in an effort to fundamentally reorient the masculinist and colonialist direction of our collective historical imagination. As I suggested earlier, Such self-consciously interventionary projects bear the burden of their politics and must therefore confront critiques that they too often produce the historical subjects that they seek and too easily assume the transparency of experience as a source of historical evidence. In Native Speakers, I contended with these issues by focusing my analytical lens on discursive production and borrowing from the critical toolbox of literary theory. In my current research project, I take a somewhat different approach, confronting the politics of knowledge production by challenging some of the basic unexamined premises behind its practice. This new project is a broad-based research initiative that extends Native speakers' engagement with the history of women of color intellectual production into the later half of the 20th century, exploring the development of Chicana feminist thought from 1965 to 1985. And since some of you may not know what I mean when I say Chicana, I mean women of Mexican-American descent who in the 1960s claimed a kind of political naming. Chicana and Chicano was a political identification for someone who was of Mexican-American descent and involved in radical politics. The project's intention is to create new feminist archives, but also to interrogate the ways in which archives themselves are constituted. And just in case everyone doesn't know what an archive is, it's a collection of someone's papers. Usually you donate it, or someone in your family donates it. If you're historically significant, you might have an archive in a library, in a university library, or perhaps in a local library. So archival collections are most often figured as both the residue and the primary building blocks of historical memory. But they are also partial and idiosyncratic formations, unavoidably subject to the vagaries of chance and the individual interests and predilections of archivists who represent the interest of increasingly corporatized institutions. Moreover, access to archival collections is usually limited to a small cadre of authorized scholars, figured as the interpreters or molders of the raw materials that might be found in an archive. When I began conceptualizing this new research project, I asked myself whether it was possible to constitute an archive that would match the liberatory potential of its central subject, Chicana feminism. What would such an archive look like? Who would help to create it? And who would have access to it? The project I came up with, Chicana por mi raza, Uncovering the Hidden Legacy of Chicana Feminism, is a web-based archive that documents the development of Chicana feminist thought through an interactive timeline that serves as an access point for digitized archival materials, oral histories, and secondary resources. A key feature of this digital archive will be an interactive wiki tool that enables women who are active in the Chicano movement in the 1960s and 70s to upload their own oral histories and material culture, and thus flesh out the historical picture of Chicana feminism that the website will offer. And while I intend to write a book on the development of Chicana feminist thought based on this research, the central goal of this project is to democratize the archive, to push against the privatization of knowledge, and envision a model of scholarship that does not transform the raw materials of the archive into scholarly commodities. Ultimately, the purpose of the website is to facilitate learning about women's history by opening up the channels through which educators and students can access primary archival materials, most of which are unavailable outside of libraries and personal collections. I hope that Chicana por mi raza will help to broaden our collective understanding of second-wave feminism, as well as the civil rights era, by documenting the experience of women of color who carved out their own particular approach to feminism at the crossroads of civil rights struggles and the women's movement. So the project grows out of my own experience with teaching an undergraduate class on the history of feminist thought. And what I found when I first conceptualized this class some 5 years ago was that there were almost no secondary resources like articles, books, or films that documented the feminist articulations of women of color in the second wave. Moreover, when I turned to other women's studies syllabi for ideas, I noticed a curious similarity. Each included a week on women of color, with readings drawn from one source, This Bridge Called My Back, which was first published in 1981. Now, I knew that Chicanas had been active in thinking and writing about feminism for at least 10 years prior to 1981 because, here's a confession, my own mother Martha Cotera had written two foundational texts in the 1970s. The first, Diosa y Hembra, Goddess and Woman, appeared in 1976 and made an historical argument for the importance of feminism to traditional Chicana political organizing. The second, The Chicana Feminist, was the first single-authored collection of essays on Chicana feminism and appeared just 1 year later in 1977. Now, admittedly, these were small press books with very limited circulation, but nevertheless, I knew that they were part of a much larger and very productive period of dialogue among women of color about the relevance of feminism to their particular political struggles. Unfortunately, most of this dialogue happened in conferences and short-lived newspapers and journals, spaces outside the academy, and in the margins of mainstream feminism. As a result, conventional accounts of the second wave had reduced the complex and diffuse nature of feminist thought in the 1970s into a dominant narrative that figured women of color as latecomers to feminism. In order to complicate this narrative for my students, my syllabus included a week on feminist radicalism that documented 1960s and 70s feminist writing by Chicanas, Native women, and Black women who were engaged in radical struggles in their own communities. I provided the students with online digitized copies of excerpts from out-of-print small press books like my mother's, radical newspapers, letters, and conference proceedings. One of these materials was a report on the International Women's Year Conference held in Mexico City in 1975, and this is a really important conference for the history of feminist thought and the feminist movement. The report that I assigned to them was written by a Chicana for the Raza Unida Party, a radical Chicano third party in Texas. The reactions from my students were predictable. Chicanas were at the IWY? There was a radical third party in Texas in the 1970s? Why didn't we know this? Indeed, why didn't they? My answer to this question inevitably returns us to the title of this talk and the preamble I gave at the start of it. Invisibility is no natural disaster. It's a product of power, the power to write history, the power to tell certain stories with authority. And like any unnatural disaster, it has serious consequences for the ways in which we understand our place in the world, as well as the politics of the possible. Take my students as an example. I had originally feared that they would be confused by the sudden shift in materials from secondary sources to primary sources, from books and articles, what you typically see on a syllabus, to PDFs of old newspapers and posters that were produced over 30 years ago. But they understood almost immediately that the switch said something about the politics of knowledge production, what gets left out of the story, who gets put into it. Moreover, and this was an unexpected bonus, coming into contact with artifacts produced in some cases by women their own age who were passionately engaged in social struggle and who voiced radical political beliefs was deeply moving for them. Many expressed the feeling that seeing these artifacts made them want to imagine more radical worlds themselves. Emboldened by this experience, I decided to take on 2 undergraduates as research assistants for this project. After spending several months reading key secondary sources on the women's movement and Chicana rights movement, sources that very rarely included anything on Chicanas, we decided to jump right into primary research this past summer. We chose Austin, Texas as our first research site because several of the women with whom we intended to conduct oral histories lived in or near the area. Moreover, my mother was an archivist and a community consultant for the Mexican American Papers Project, an archive with significant Chicano movement holdings that she helped to establish at the University of Texas some 30 years ago. So we had an in there. She also retained a significant collection of archival materials in her own home where we could stay at no cost. So we spent a little bit over a week in Austin. During the first half of the week, we identified and digitized materials in my mother's personal archives and in the Mexican American Papers Project. And on the weekend, we conducted oral histories with women who were active in the Raza Unida Party in the 1970s, including my mother. All in all, we accomplished a massive amount of work, digitizing hundreds of materials, photocopying those materials we couldn't digitize, and interviewing some of the most significant women in Chicano politics in Texas. My students spent long hours in the library and stayed up late going through my mother's archives, watching the excitement of these young women as they uncovered the memos, speeches, posters, conference programs, radical journals, and ephemera documenting the history of Chicana's engagement with feminism was the most amazing experience for me. It was not only a poignant reminder of the passion that led me to the archive in the first place, but also a barometer for what I hoped that this project might accomplish. Their enthusiasm and excitement will be duplicated, I hope, in countless other young women and men as they discover for themselves the hidden histories that my students have helped me to make available. I had one assignment that I required of my students during this research trip. At the end of each day, I had asked the students to pick a document that they found moving or meaningful or resonant or just plain interesting and share it with the group. We looked at radical youth movement publications written by 14 and 16-year-olds from Ann Arbor, Michigan, written in 1971. There was a radical youth liberation army in Ann Arbor, Michigan of like high school kids. Seriously, so crazy. We looked at, for example, a very short-lived lesbian of color journal that predated the publication of this bridge called My Back by about 4 years. We also looked at memos, posters, other kinds of artifacts that opened up whole worlds of experience, heretofore unknown to us. One day, one of the students, a sweet farm girl from Tecumseh, Michigan, shared a one-page handwritten document. It was a press release procedure for Ramsey Muniz, a young lawyer who was running for governor of Texas under the Razonida Party ticket in 1972. And by the way, the lieutenant governor on that ticket was a woman. The document was written by a young woman named Evie Chapa, who was Muniz's campaign manager in Central Texas. Evie was about 21 years old at the time. A few years later, along with my mother, she would found the Chicana Research and Learning Center, a small publishing house for writing by and about women of color. But for now, she was playing a major organizing role in the gubernatorial campaign and in way over her head, working with party leaders, some of whom were very sexist men. The press release procedure was really a pedestrian document listing the process for writing and distributing party press releases. Number 1, take call from state party organizer. Number 2, take dictated press release. Number 3, mimeograph 20 copies. Number 4, take them to the Capitol press room. Number 5, leave a copy in each mailbox. Number 6, go home satisfied with a job well done. Across the top of the document was written, "Don't fuck it up." Pardon me, I'm sorry if I offended anyone with that. It's an archive, it wasn't me. My student pulled this seemingly insignificant document because it spoke to her in some way. Perhaps because she knew that Evie Chapa was her age when she wrote it, and that her standing in party politics was complicated by her age and gender. Or perhaps it revealed something to her about the everyday practice of real politics. In any case, she was moved, as was her research partner. That night, the two of them snuck off and got tattoos inspired by the iconography they found in the radical newspapers they uncovered during their research, without me knowing it. The next morning, my sweet farm girl from Tecumseh, Michigan, displayed hers with much pride. It was a picture of a woman some 8 inches tall, holding a sheaf of wheat in one arm and a rifle in the other. Underneath her were the words, "Viva Feminista." And I don't think her mother knows about this, so just keep it to yourself. I didn't mention any names. So while my students were clearly inspired by the documents they found, I was inspired by their enthusiasm, their professionalism, and their incredible dedication to our project goals, all of which reminded me of why I do this work in the first place. Late one night, as we sat up chatting and decompressing after a long day of sifting through the archives, one of my students hit upon a metaphor that really encapsulated what we experienced on our trip. She said that our experience was like a dream in which one discovers a door to a hidden room in a house that seems very familiar, maybe your own home. Opening that door transforms everything. All of a sudden, what was pedestrian, familiar, common, becomes a new terrain, a place of possibility and promise, all within one's reach. Discovering histories in our midst is like opening that door and finding a new world that reshapes our relationship to the old one. Just a few weeks after our visit, my mother dropped a bombshell on me. She'd been fired from her job as an archivist and community consultant for the Mexican American Papers Project, an archival collection that she founded. More precisely, she'd been offered a Cataloger 1 position with the library, since her services as a collector of materials were no longer needed. It took me a few days to recover from the shock before I could think clearly about her situation. Two things occurred to me at once. First, that had the head of special collections who ultimately made this decision actually spent a few days in the archives as we had, she would have understood how foundational my mother was to both the Mexican American Papers Project and Chicano politics in Texas, the history that the collection seeks to preserve. The second thing I realized came upon me like an old-school feminist consciousness-raising click moment. One thing about my last book that really bothered me was that I was never able to explain why Zora Neale Hurston, Ella Deloria, and Haveta Gonzalez had fallen into obscurity so precipitously. Each had been a leading figure in folklore and anthropology circles in their youth, but by the time they hit their 60s, their work was largely unknown to students in those fields. My mother's fate brought their invisibility into focus. Indeed, I was watching the mechanics of invisibility play out before my very eyes, and suddenly I knew how it happened. I saw how someone could work all their life to preserve a history and then be shoved to the margins of that history because they'd not worked hard enough to preserve their own place in it. Without someone to tell your story to, and someone who has the power to tell it to others, you do become invisible. And sadly, that continues to be the fate of women of color intellectuals. It reminded me that, to paraphrase Alice Walker, we must tend our mother's gardens with care, for if we do not, the weeds will most assuredly obscure the many flowers that they planted. In closing, I want to stress that delving into the hidden history of gender and sexuality is not simply about bringing greater diversity to our accounts of history, nor is it only a matter of setting the record straight. It's about the politics of history making itself, both in terms of historical actors and those who many years later, like you, will write their history. It is about who gets to tell their stories and whether or not those stories are considered vital to our world. But it is also animated by feelings that surpass the bounds of conventional scholarly discourse. Indeed, those feelings are the excess of that discourse. Anthropologist Virginia Dominguez has argued that the impulse to rescue that animates ethnographic and historical recovery projects is like a form of love. The kind of love Dominguez has in mind is not the uncritical fetishization of the marginalized, which, as Scott points out, is a form of objectification, but, quote, the kind of love, respect, and affection we feel for family members, tough love at times, but never disengagement or hagiography. If recovery at its core is an act of love, then like my students, I suppose I wear my heart on my sleeve. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I wonder, have your students been to the Labadee collection at Special Collections?
They have. As
That's
a matter
such
of
a
that's
great-
where we started out.
I was going to say, that's a great, great archive for that kind of thing.
It is a great archive. The Labadee collection is really a radical politics archival collection. It's at the University of Michigan. There is, in fact, a lot of the material that we found in my mother's personal archives were duplicates of some of the material that we found in the Labadee collection. And I think I want to say something about archives. when I talk about constituting an archive online, a digital archive online, it's because literally these archives are in the personal collections of people who were in civil rights struggles. They're not in they're generally not in libraries. The Labadie is one exception, and Ann Arbor was a site of radical politics, a pretty important one. It's where the Students for a Democratic Society was founded. So there's a tremendous amount of wealth of archives in the Labadie in terms of radical politics. Any other questions?
We have one right here.
Yeah, I'm Rick Verberg, one of the trustees at the college here. And
Sorry about the F-bomb. Please forgive me.
Just had a question now. Would you say, Professor, that in the future, because of the women researchers and women professors, that women history will be more accurately reflected? Kind of a basic question. You kind of go along with that.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I mean, I think that really you're looking at the generation of researchers that are really going to, carry the weight and the burden of diversifying our history. And when I say diversifying our history, I mean, literally telling the stories of people who don't usually get their stories told. In my case, I'm very interested in women of color intellectuals, but I think there's lots of stories to be told. And what we have to do is get out there and get those letters and that correspondence and do those oral histories, really. So I'm a recent discoverer of oral histories, but they're really very profound as sources of evidence for historical narrative.
Thank you very much for your talk. I find the effort you take in bringing your students to the archives very admirable. And I'm wondering if any of your students have considered perhaps writing fictional accounts of some of the women they have investigated in the archives that might appeal to audiences that would not be interested in purely scholarly works.
Right. That's a really great question. They haven't, but what they are interested in this, and this is some indication of where both scholarship and where our students are, where scholarship is going and where our students are. They are writing Wikipedia entries on some of the women who we interviewed. And that, it's not fiction, but it is a kind of popular form, and it's a way of sort of getting pretty obscure figures into the network, right? So that's what they're doing. One of my students will be writing an honors thesis on one of the women that we interviewed, and she may be making a contribution to a book that I'm working on. So.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. I'm fascinated by your research. I'm wondering, in your talk you mentioned dominant discourse and something else that is perhaps not dominant discourse, right? And from what I understand, I'm a political scientist, so social science is just dominant discourse for me anyways. But if you could locate your research, or perhaps the research in the ethnography anthropology field that you are working in, as far as I understand, where is this dominant discourse right now? Is your kind of research becoming a more dominant discourse, or is it still this separation between dominant discourse and something that is not, or maybe narrative-oriented discourse that this is a paradigm that you are working within? So if you just speak a little bit about that.
That's an excellent question. I mean, this is what Joan Scott's, the intervention that she makes is that so much of the history that we try, the corrective history, right, the histories of difference, the histories of minority subjects, of women, of queer subjects, attempts to undermine dominant discourse, but it uses the same kinds of practices and methodologies, so it becomes essentially the very thing that it intends to undermine. This is the critique. I would say that, given that there's no real book on Chicana feminist thought, it's still not part of dominant discourse. Is my aim to make it part of dominant discourse? I think that's a question that, I guess it is. I guess I don't have the problem that Joan Scott does with becoming dominant discourse, frankly, for people who are really invisible in our historical imagination. I know that's wrong and contradictory, but I think that history is actually a process, in a constant process of rewriting, right, and expanding and diversifying and sort of complicating our collective vision. And so that's why I think it's actually it's healthy, you know. Yeah.
Recently, the StoryCorps was here in Grand Rapids. Have you been probing that for the narrative histories, particularly of those women of color or Chicano writers or speakers?
You know, like I said, we did oral histories, and I'll tell you about another project that I'm interested in. That's actually is a collaborative project with a community organization in Southwest Detroit to create a museum of Latino history that is similar to the Arab American Museum or the African American Museum. And one of the elements that the community would like to include is a permanent booth, a StoryCorps type booth where young people can take like their grandparents and ask them their stories. I'm actually, which I think is just a wonderful idea. And one of the elements of the website that we want to create will be in fact digitized oral histories that can be downloaded and played and easily accessed. Right now, we haven't looked at any other oral histories in archives or through StoryCorps because we're actually doing them, you know, going to different sites and doing these oral histories. But I also wanted to say that the wiki tool that I mentioned, one thing that happens, inasmuch as Chicana feminism is a product of, or has a dominant narrative, like historical narratives about the Chicano movement more generally, it tends to focus on the Southwest. And so what you have is sort of dominant narratives emerging from Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and California. And so one of the things that we wanted to incorporate into our website was a wiki tool that would enable women in other places like Chicago, Pennsylvania, and all of these different places where we don't necessarily look for Chicana feminism. We look for it in the Southwest, right? Which leads to a sort of dominant narrative about it being only something that happened in the Southwest. But we're very interested in enabling women who experienced that history and who took part in it to engage with the website and upload their own oral histories, giving them the tools to do that, and even uploading like PDFs of, you know, archival materials, letters and newsletters that they might have, you know, circulated or read or whatever. So I think one thing about the engaging with new media, right, to kind of expand the narrative is that you let go, as an historian, you let go of the control of the narrative. You know, you can't, like, someone who's, and if you've ever done civil rights histories, anyone here who does that knows that there are very radically different opinions about one historical event, right, based on one's politics, where one stood on an issue around ideology. And so there's a lot of arguing back and forth and disagreement. And so one scary thing about opening up the wiki tool is that anyone can post anything. I mean, we would obviously kind of control it, and we have an advisory board of people who would look over that kind of stuff. But it's a little frightening for someone who's used to writing books or controlling the way information is produced to kind of open it up in this radical way. But I really can't see any other way to not fall into, you know, the same trap of like just replicating a narrative about a certain history simply because we rely on what evidence we have. And because I'm collecting this archive with my students, we're literally constituting the archive. We're constituting our own archives. So there's some problems with that. It would lead to, you know, the places where we intend to go and the people we intend to talk to would control and constrain the vision of Chicana feminism that we would produce. So hence the wiki tool, which is really frightening to me, but my students like the idea. So.
You've talked a lot about Wiki. I'm interested in your thoughts about how other social media, Facebook, Twitter, are influencing one's perceptions of self or visibility or identity and authenticity.
I direct the Latino Studies program at the University of Michigan, and we just set up our group on Facebook. And it's interesting, I think, on the one hand, we think of these as very inauthentic modes of expression, right? Because they're mediated by this kind of, this interface, this computer interface that always, there's this sort of shadow of inauthenticity that lurks behind it. At the same time, it's kind of like the Wild West out there, I mean, people can post all kinds of stuff. We start our Friends of Latino Studies Facebook group, and I gave members an admin access, and surprise, surprise, some things get posted on there that I'm a little, not sure that Latino Studies ought to be the avenue through which they get posted. It's fine, but so I think that there's, I talked about the democratizing effect of knowledge production. I think that web interface gives us that. If we give up, we may have to give up a little control over it, right? And that's why I think, I was going to collect these archives from all of these women, digitize all of these archives, and I really didn't want those archives to go into special collections, some place where you would have to, normal students can go and look at them, right? I wanted people who were active in the movement back then, and students and people of all ages, to be able to access this material easily and to interface with it, right, and to organize it in whatever way they wanted. I didn't want to control that narrative. So I don't think I answered your question, but I think I'm still learning a lot. My students are way ahead of the curve from me. They're way ahead on this, but I think there's a lot of possibilities for social networking and for web interfaces, especially for uploading oral histories, especially for uploading family documents, for example, family histories. I think it's really powerful. And one sort of side thing, very quickly, I mentioned that Caballero, this book written by Haveta Gonzalez, this folklorist, was co-written by an Anglo woman. And what's happened in the critical reception of that book is it's been seen as a Chicano novel, as a foundational Chicano novel, because it's about 1848, and this is a foundational moment for most Chicano historians. And they see her as the only author, right? And I have been really struggling against this reading of the text. I think it's very important that it's a collaborative text, that it's a cross-racial collaboration, that it was written in the borderlands. All of these things are very resonant to me. And I had been looking, up until my book was published, for any information on this other author. This Margaret Eimer was her name. Nothing. We went to the genealogical archives of LDS's genealogical archives. We looked for her everywhere and couldn't find anything. My book came out, and someone Googled, I guess one of her family members, Googled her name and found me and sent me an email 2 days after I received my published book, saying, I have another copy of the Caballero manuscript. And it was a manuscript that I recovered along with another scholar, and we had Haveta Gonzalez's copy, and he had his great-aunt's copy. And he found me, basically, through the internet. And so I relate that story because, I know that a lot of scholars worry about Wikipedia and how it might degrade the production of knowledge in the contemporary moment. But I got to tell you, I can't go back and rewrite that book with the new information that I have. If I had a Wikipedia entry on her, then I could, right? Or some other scholar, or even her heir could have rewritten my work, and it would have been monitored in some way, and can change. And so that's what I think about, the new sort of media for producing knowledge is not necessarily a degradation of knowledge. It can lead to better knowledge, better historical knowledge, I think. You have to be careful with it, but still.
Oh, thank you, Professor, for your talk tonight. I've really enjoyed it. On that same note, I was wondering, the archive, your mother's archive was an archive that you had personal knowledge of, and you spoke of how it was, the discussion is sort of centered in the southwest of the United States, but hoping that it may inspire or uncover other archives in other parts of the country. Are there some other archives or things that you might think this project will unearth, or that you hope to have unearthed?
Right. I mean, I think my mother's interesting because she was a librarian. And so when she founded the Chicana Research and Learning Center, which was basically a Women's Educational Equity Act grantee, right? And so they founded this research center that was totally not affiliated with any university or anything. It was just these feminists working and creating this, right? They put together all of these bibliographies and asked feminists to send them materials. And so her archive is gigantic. And it's basically stuff, like I said, from Ann Arbor, from Chicago, from New York. It's stuff from all over the place. Now, we can presume that the women that she was writing to and asking for these materials from also have their own equally rich archives, right? And so we have names of people that we want to interview. And when we go to do our interviews, we explain the project to them, and we take our scanner, and tell them we're not going to take your materials, because a lot of these women don't want to give their materials up. We just want to scan them. And we're going to upload them to this site, and they'll be available for everyone. And so our hope is that, in fact, we will, as we interview women and go to their homes, we will uncover equally rich archives. But on the other hand, I think that the wiki tool, if we can make it work, the state-by-state wiki, will allow women who might, have access to a scanner to photocopy stuff and upload it to the site as well. So I think that making it a kind of porous archive enables a collection that's less directed by our own sort of blinders about what we're looking for. Because this is the problem with the archive. We all have a crazy grandmother or aunt that hasn't ever thrown anything away, right? Well, some of that stuff might be profoundly important to filling in a tiny gap in history that nobody knows anything about, right? So there's never, my mother was a librarian, so there's no artifact that's completely insignificant. And the question is, how do we make it not so directed by the interest of the institution or the scholars and more kind of open, right?
Dr. Cotera, you just helped me realize that I should have had the historians come and clean up my dad's house after he died last spring. It would have saved my whole family a lot of time and effort if we had known those were artifacts rather than junk that he had been collecting all along. Are there any other questions?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Cotera.
Thank you. I'm so glad my phone didn't go off. I realized halfway through that I hadn't turned it off, and I was like, God. It has a really corny ringtone.
If you have one of these assessment forms to turn in, there's a table toward the back on this side, or hand them to Professor Light on your way out. If you didn't get one, I have some for you here.
And please remember, there are more events for the Gender and Sexuality Symposium tomorrow. There are brochures available right on the tables on your way out.